You think you know neighbor disputes until your arrogant new neighbor builds a $50,000 luxury deck 3 feet onto your property, refuses to move it, and threatens to sue you when you complain. But what he didn't know is that I'm a land surveyor who just discovered that his entire $800,000 house is built 6 feet into my property line, and I'm about to use that information to destroy his life in the most spectacular way possible. Hi everyone, I'm Jake. I need to tell you about the most satisfying property dispute revenge I've ever executed against a neighbor who thought he could bully me into giving up my land rights. This story takes place in Riverside Estates, an upscale suburban neighborhood where I've lived peacefully for 8 years. My house is a modest 3-bedroom ranch on a half-acre lot that I bought as a young professional and have been slowly improving over the years. For 7 years, my next-door neighbors were the Hendersons, an elderly couple who kept to themselves and maintained their property beautifully. We had a friendly relationship. We'd chat over the fence occasionally, help each other with packages, and generally coexisted peacefully. But last year, the Hendersons sold their house to retire to Florida, and their property was bought by Chad Morrison, a 45-year-old real estate developer who immediately made it clear that he thought he was too good for our boring suburban neighborhood. Chad was everything you'd expect from an entitled, nouveau rich developer. He drove a brand new BMW SUV, wore expensive clothes even for yard work, and talked constantly about his successful business ventures and luxury lifestyle. From the day he moved in, Chad treated the neighborhood like his personal kingdom. He parked his work trucks on the street for weeks at a time, played loud music during his backyard parties, and made it clear that he considered himself superior to the rest of us small-time homeowners. But Chad's arrogance became a real problem when he decided to upgrade his new property with luxury amenities that would increase the neighborhood's property values. What he really did was start a property war that would end with his entire house being demolished. The $50,000 deck invasion. 3 months after Chad moved in, he began construction on what he called his entertainment deck, a massive, multi-level outdoor structure with a built-in kitchen, fireplace, hot tub, and seating area for 30-plus people. The construction was disruptive enough. Crews working from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, trucks blocking the street, and noise that made it impossible to enjoy my own backyard. But I figured it was temporary and tried to be patient. The problem started when I noticed that Chad's deck was being built very close to our shared property line. Too close. I went out to take a closer look and realized that the deck wasn't just close to the property line, it was extending onto MY property. The massive deck structure, including the outdoor kitchen and hot tub, was built approximately 3 feet into my yard. I immediately went to talk to Chad about the issue. Hey Chad, I wanted to talk to you about the new deck. It looks like it might be extending onto my property. Chad was standing on his deck, which was clearly on my side of what I knew to be the property line, drinking a beer and surveying his construction project like a king overlooking his domain. Jake, right? I don't think there's any problem with the deck placement. I had my contractors measure everything carefully. I'm pretty sure the property line runs along that row of trees, which would put part of your deck on my land. Those trees aren't the property line, buddy. The property line is much further back. I've done my research. I could see that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Chad's tone was dismissive and condescending, like he was talking to a child who didn't understand how property ownership worked. Chad, I've lived here for 8 years, and I'm pretty familiar with my property boundaries. Would you be willing to have the property surveyed to clarify the exact line? I'm not paying for a survey because you're confused about where your property ends. My deck is completely on my land, and that's the end of the discussion. If you're confident about that, then a survey should confirm it and resolve any concerns. Jake, let me explain something to you. I'm a professional real estate developer. I understand property boundaries better than some suburban homeowner who probably bought the first house he could afford. My deck is on my property, and I'm not wasting money on a survey to prove what I already know. The arrogance in Chad's voice made my blood boil, but I tried to stay calm. Chad, I'd really appreciate it if we could just verify the boundaries to make sure there's no issue. There is no issue except for your confusion about where your property ends. Maybe you should spend less time worrying about my improvements and more time upgrading your own property. That's when I knew Chad wasn't going to be reasonable about this situation. He had made up his mind that he was right, and he wasn't interested in facts or evidence that might contradict his position. But Chad had made a critical error. He had just been condescending and dismissive towards someone whose profession is land surveying. The professional investigation. What Chad didn't know about me is that I'm a licensed land surveyor with 15 years of experience in property boundary disputes. I know exactly how to research property lines, and I have access to all the tools and databases needed to determine precise boundaries. The next morning, I pulled the official property record for both our lots and began my investigation. The first thing I discovered was that Chad was completely wrong about the property line location. The boundary between our properties ran exactly where I thought it did, along the row of trees that Chad had dismissed. Chad's deck wasn't just slightly encroaching on my property. The entire outdoor kitchen, the hot tub, and approximately 40% of the deck structure were built on my land. But as I continued researching the property boundaries and comparing them to the current structures, I discovered something that made me smile with anticipation. Chad's house itself appeared to be built over the property line. I spent the weekend doing a comprehensive survey of both properties using professional-grade equipment. I measured every structure, every boundary marker, and every significant feature on both lots. What I found was absolutely incredible. Chad's entire house was built 6 feet onto my property. Not just the deck, not just a small encroachment. The entire $800,000 house that Chad was so proud of was sitting on land that legally belonged to me. The historical records investigation. To make sure I had my facts straight, I dove deep into the property records and construction history. Chad's lot had originally been larger, but 15 years ago, the previous owner had sold a strip of land to my property to resolve an easement dispute. The sale had been properly recorded, and the property boundaries had been legally modified. However, when Chad's house was built 12 years ago, before he owned it, the builder had apparently used old property surveys that didn't reflect the boundary change. The house was built based on outdated information about where the property line was located. For 12 years, this error had gone unnoticed because the original owners of both properties had been friendly neighbors who didn't worry about precise boundaries. The Hendersons had probably never realized that their house was technically on my property. But Chad's arrogant assumption that he could build on my land without permission had prompted me to do the research that revealed this massive property encroachment. Chad didn't just owe me 40% of his deck. He owed me his entire house. Before confronting Chad with this information, I consulted with a property attorney who specialized in boundary disputes. Jake, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of property encroachment I've ever seen, the lawyer told me. You have absolute legal ownership of the land that Chad's house is built on. What are my options for resolving this? You have several options, ranging from negotiating a land sale to demanding that all structures be removed from your property. Given the scope of the encroachment, you have tremendous leverage in this situation. What if Chad refuses to acknowledge the boundary issue? Then you can force the issue through the courts. With this level of encroachment, you could potentially demand that his entire house be demolished and rebuilt on his actual property. That seems extreme. It is extreme, but it's also your legal right. Chad built on your property without permission. The fact that he doesn't know his house is encroaching doesn't change the legal reality. What would be a reasonable first step? I'd recommend presenting Chad with the survey results and offering to sell him the encroaching land at fair market value. If he's reasonable, you could resolve this amicably and make some money in the process. And if he's not reasonable, then you take him to court and force him to remove all structures from your property at his expense. I decided to give Chad one chance to handle this situation like a civilized adult before pursuing more aggressive legal action. The confrontation. The next evening, I went to Chad's house with a folder containing all my survey results, property records, and legal documentation. Chad answered the door, holding a beer and looking annoyed that I was interrupting his evening. Jake, what can I do for you? I hope you're not still worried about my deck placement. Actually, Chad, I am. I've done some research, and I think you're going to want to see what I've discovered. I told you already, my deck is on my property. I don't know why you keep obsessing over this. Chad, I'm a licensed land surveyor, and I've done a comprehensive property boundary survey. Your deck is built 3 feet onto my property. That's impossible. My contractors measured everything. I handed him the survey results. Here's the documentation. The property line runs exactly where I said it did, along the tree line. Your outdoor kitchen, hot tub, and a significant portion of your deck are on my land. Chad glanced at the papers dismissively. I don't know what kind of amateur survey you did, but professional contractors don't make mistakes like that. Chad, this isn't an amateur survey. I used professional equipment and referenced official property records. The measurements are accurate to within inches. Even if your survey is correct, which I doubt, we're talking about a few feet of overlap. That's not a big deal between neighbors. Actually, it is a big deal because you've built permanent structures on my property without permission. Look, Jake, even if there's some minor property line issue, I'm sure we can work something out between neighbors. Maybe I can buy that little strip of land from you for a reasonable price. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Chad, before we talk about the deck, there's something else you need to know about the property boundaries. What else? Your house is also built on my property. Chad laughed. That's ridiculous. My house is obviously on my own lot. According to the official property records and my survey, your entire house is built 6 feet onto my property. Chad's smile disappeared. That's impossible. I handed him additional documentation. The property boundary was modified 15 years ago, but your house was built based on outdated survey information. Your entire house is sitting on land that legally belongs to me. Chad stared at the documents for several minutes, and I could see his confidence starting to crack. This has to be some kind of mistake in the records. It's not a mistake. I've verified the information through multiple sources. Your house is built on my property, and it has been for 12 years. Well, if that's true, then we obviously need to work out some kind of arrangement. I mean, the house has been here for 12 years. There has to be some kind of grandfather clause or something. There's no grandfather clause for building on someone else's property without permission. Jake, be reasonable here. We're neighbors. We should be able to work something out that makes sense for both of us. I found it interesting that Chad was suddenly interested in being reasonable now that he realized his house was at stake. I'm willing to be reasonable, Chad. I'll sell you the land your house is built on for fair market value, plus the cost of dealing with this legal issue. What would that cost? Based on comparable land values in this neighborhood, I'd estimate $120,000 for the land, plus $15,000 for legal and survey costs. $135,000? That's insane. I'm not paying that much because of some technical boundary issue. Chad, you're currently living in a house that's built entirely on my property. $135,000 is much less than it would cost you to demolish your house and rebuild it on your actual lot. You can't be serious about making me tear down my house. I don't want to make you tear down your house. I want to sell you the land so we can resolve this issue legally and fairly. I'm not paying $135,000 because of your survey. This whole thing is probably just a scam to extort money from me. And there it was, Chad's true character coming out. Instead of acknowledging his mistake and try to work out a fair solution, he was accusing me of running a scam. Chad, this isn't a scam. This is a legal property boundary issue that needs to be resolved. I'm not paying you a cent, Jake. If you want to pursue this ridiculous claim, you could take me to court. But I guarantee you that no judge is going to make me tear down my house because of some disputed property line. All right, Chad. I tried to resolve this reasonably. Now we'll let the courts decide. As I walked away from Chad's house, I felt a mixture of disappointment and anticipation. I was disappointed that Chad had chosen to be stubborn and unreasonable, but I was anticipating the look on his face when he realized how badly he had miscalculated his legal position. The next morning, I filed a lawsuit against Chad for trespassing, demanding that all structures be removed from my property within 30 days. Chad hired his own attorney and filed a countersuit claiming that I was harassing him with frivolous legal actions. But Chad's lawyer quickly realized that his client's position was legally indefensible. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Chad's attorney called my attorney requesting a settlement meeting. My client is willing to discuss purchasing the disputed property, Chad's lawyer said. What would your client consider a reasonable price? Given the escalation to litigation and my client's legal costs, we're now requesting $175,000 for the land, plus all legal fees. That's significantly higher than the original asking price. Your client chose litigation over negotiation. The price reflects the additional legal complexity and costs involved. I need to discuss this with my client and get back to you. 3 days later, Chad's lawyer called back with a counteroffer. My client is willing to pay $75,000 for the property, with each party responsible for their own legal costs. That's not even close to fair market value for the land. Our position remains $175,000 plus legal costs. Mr. Morrison believes that's an unreasonable demand. Then Mr. Morrison can explain to a judge why he thinks he should be able to keep his house on someone else's property for free. The settlement negotiations stalled, and the case proceeded toward trial. The survey evidence. As part of the legal discovery process, both sides hired independent surveyors to verify the property boundaries. All 3 surveyors, mine, Chad's, and the court-appointed neutral surveyor, reached the same conclusion. Chad's house was built entirely on my property. There was no disputing the facts. The property records were clear, the boundary markers were documented, and the measurements were consistent across all surveys. Chad's attorney tried to argue for adverse possession, claiming that 12 years of occupation gave Chad legal right to the property. But adverse possession requires that the occupation be open, notorious, and hostile, meaning that Chad would have had to knowingly occupy my property against my will for the required time period. Since Chad didn't even know his house was on my property until I told him, and since the encroachment was the result of a construction error rather than intentional occupation, adverse possession didn't apply. Chad's attorney also tried to argue for equitable estoppel, claiming that it would be unfair to force Chad to remove his house because he had invested money in the property in good faith. But the judge wasn't sympathetic to that argument either. Mr. Morrison had a legal obligation to ensure that his construction was on his own property, the judge said during a preliminary hearing. The fact that he failed to do proper due diligence doesn't create any obligation for the actual property owner to remedy Mr. Morrison's mistake. The public humiliation. While the legal case was proceeding, word of the property dispute spread throughout our neighborhood and beyond. The local newspaper picked up the story. $1 million home built on wrong property in boundary dispute. The story included details about Chad's arrogant dismissal of my initial concerns and his refusal to pay for the land he was occupying. Social media posts about the case went viral in our city, with people sharing the story as an example of karma catching up with an arrogant neighbor. This guy builds a deck on his neighbor's property, then finds out his entire house is on the wrong lot. Faced with tears of joy was a typical comment. Chad became a local laughingstock. The wealthy developer who was so confident about property boundaries that he didn't bother to verify where his own house was located. Real estate professionals in our area started using Chad's case as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper surveying before construction. The humiliation was so intense that Chad stopped hosting his loud backyard parties and rarely spent time outside where neighbors could see him. The trial. The case went to trial 4 months after I filed the lawsuit. My attorney presented a straightforward case. I owned the property. Chad had built structures on my property without permission, and Chad had refused to pay fair market value for the land. Chad's attorney tried to argue that forcing demolition would be an excessive remedy that would cause his client irreparable harm. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison invested $800,000 in this home in good faith, based on surveys provided by professional contractors. Forcing him to demolish and relocate his entire house would be financially devastating. My attorney responded, Your Honor, Mr. Morrison's financial situation is not the plaintiff's responsibility. Mr. Morrison built on property he doesn't own, and he has refused to purchase the property at fair market value. The plaintiff has no obligation to subsidize Mr. Morrison's construction error. The judge asked about my willingness to sell the property rather than demanding demolition. Your Honor, I offered to sell Mr. Morrison the property for fair market value plus legal costs. He refused and chose to litigate instead. At this point, I'm requesting that all structures be removed from my property. The judge took the case under advisement and scheduled a ruling for the following week. The verdict: Judge Patricia Williams delivered her ruling on a Wednesday morning in a packed courtroom. This case involves a clear-cut property boundary dispute with unambiguous survey evidence. Mr. Morrison's house and deck are built entirely on property legally owned by Mr. Henderson. Mr. Morrison had multiple opportunities to resolve this issue by purchasing the property at fair market value, but he chose to refuse reasonable settlement offers and force this matter to trial. While the court recognizes that demolition is an extreme remedy, property owners have an absolute right to exclusive use of their land. Mr. Morrison's financial investment in structures built on someone else's property does not create any legal right to continued occupation. Therefore, the court orders Mr. Morrison to remove all structures from Mr. Henderson's property within 90 days. If Mr. Morrison fails to comply with this order, the court will authorize Mr. Henderson to remove the structures at Mr. Morrison's expense. Additionally, Mr. Morrison is ordered to pay $47,000 in attorney's fees and court costs to Mr. Henderson. Chad looked like he had been hit by a truck. His attorney immediately requested an appeal, but the judge denied a stay of execution. Chad had 90 days to demolish his $800,000 house and move it to his actual property. Chad's appeals were unsuccessful, and he was forced to comply with the court order. Rather than pay for professional demolition and try to salvage materials, Chad decided to sell the house to a demolition company for scrap value. The demolition took 3 weeks and was a neighborhood spectacle. People drove by to watch the expensive house being torn down because of Chad's arrogance and legal miscalculation. Local news crews covered the demolition with stories about the importance of proper surveying before construction and what happens when property disputes go to court. Chad had to pay the demolition company $15,000 to remove his house from my property. He received approximately $45,000 for the salvageable materials, meaning his $800,000 house netted him $30,000 after demolition costs. He also had to remove his beloved $50,000 deck, which had started this entire dispute. In total, Chad lost over $800,000 in property value, plus $47,000 in legal costs, plus $15,000 in demolition costs. All because he was too arrogant to pay $135,000 for the land his house was built on. The aftermath. After the demolition was complete, Chad put his empty lot up for sale and moved out of the neighborhood. The lot sold for $180,000, significantly less than he had paid for the property with the house, since buyers now knew about the boundary issues and reduced lot size. Chad's total financial loss from this property dispute was estimated at over $900,000. But the most satisfying part wasn't the financial destruction. It was watching Chad's arrogance turn into desperation as he realized how badly he had miscalculated his position. The man who had been so condescending about my confusion regarding property boundaries had to watch his house get demolished because he didn't understand property boundaries himself. The man who claimed to be a professional real estate developer had to explain to his friends and business associates why his house was being torn down due to a basic surveying error. The man who thought he was too sophisticated for our boring suburban neighborhood became the neighborhood cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets reality. The property development. With Chad's house gone, I now owned a much larger property with development potential. I hired an architect to design a new house that would take advantage of the expanded lot size while staying well within the proper boundaries. I also landscaped the area where Chad's house had been, creating a beautiful garden space and expanding my backyard entertainment area. The property improvements increased my home's value by approximately $150,000, ironically giving me the luxury outdoor space that Chad had thought he was creating for himself. Several neighbors commented that the new landscaping looked much better than Chad's oversized house had. "Jake, I have to say, your property looks amazing now that you have all that extra space," my neighbor across the street told me. Chad's house always seemed too big for that lot anyway. The professional reputation. As a land surveyor, This case became one of my most famous professional successes. Other surveyors and attorneys started referring clients to me specifically because of my handling of the Morrison case. "You're the guy who made that developer tear down his whole house, right?" became a common introduction at professional events. The case was written up in surveying and legal publications as an example of how proper boundary research can resolve seemingly complex property disputes. I was invited to speak at conferences about property boundary issues and the importance of professional surveying before construction. My business grew significantly due to the publicity from the case, with many clients specifically requesting my services because they had heard about my thorough approach to boundary disputes. The lesson for Chad. I occasionally wondered if Chad learned anything from this expensive lesson about humility and proper due diligence. Based on conversations with mutual acquaintances, it seems like Chad's main takeaway was that he was the victim of an unfair legal system, rather than the consequences of his own arrogance and poor decision-making. He apparently tells people that I scammed him with technical legal tricks and that the judge was biased against developers. Chad has apparently never acknowledged that he could have resolved the entire situation for $135,000 if he hadn't been too proud to admit his mistake and too arrogant to treat me with basic respect. The current situation. 3 years later, I'm still living happily in my expanded property with my beautiful gardens and upgraded outdoor spaces. Chad moved to a different city and apparently works for someone else's development company now rather than running his own business. The empty lot where his house used to be was eventually bought by a young family who built a modest, properly surveyed house well within their property boundaries. The new neighbors are friendly, respectful people who understand the importance of good neighborly relationships and proper property maintenance. I occasionally get calls from other property owners facing boundary disputes, asking for advice based on my experience with the Morrison case. My standard advice is always the same. Document everything. Know your rights. Be willing to negotiate fairly, but don't let arrogant neighbors bully you into giving up your property rights. Update. I recently heard through neighborhood gossip that Chad tried to sue his original contractors for building his house on the wrong property. Apparently, that lawsuit was unsuccessful because the statute of limitations had expired. Some people never learn that their problems are caused by their own poor decisions rather than everyone else being unfair to them. Have you ever dealt with neighbor boundary disputes or property encroachment issues? How do you handle neighbors who refuse to acknowledge property lines or try to bully you into giving up your rights? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments.